Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. It wasn't the first time the hallway light flickered at odd intervals. Comings and goings were routine, a shuffle of footsteps that no one bothered to track. The mail piled neatly, except for the one envelope that always seemed to be missing. I didn't turn to see or ask who took it. It simply belonged somewhere else. The room felt a degree cooler than it should have been, and the curtains hung just a bit unevenly. I adjusted the blinds without thinking much of it. When I left, I made sure the blinds were uneven again. To whoever reads this, if anyone ever does, I'm writing because I can't carry this anymore. The weight of it sits behind my ribs like a stone that's grown too heavy for my chest to hold. You won't believe what I'm about to tell you. Hell, I'm not sure I believe it myself, but it happened, or something happened. Something that changed the way light falls through windows, the way my own reflection looks back at me. I've kept this secret for so long that it's become part of my breathing. In, out, remember, forget, but forgetting doesn't work anymore. The thing about secrets is they don't stay buried. They seep through the cracks in your sleep. They whisper in the spaces between your heartbeats. Maybe you'll think I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. There's this sound, a low humming that starts somewhere behind my left ear and spreads like warm honey through my skull. It began that night, the night everything shifted sideways. I hear it now as I write this, my pen scratching against paper in rhythm with that endless, gentle buzz. Sometimes I wonder if it's the sound of the world turning, or maybe it's just the sound of me coming undone. The blinds, I keep thinking about the blinds. I've always been particular about straight lines, even surfaces, things in their proper place. But that night something in me needed them crooked, needed that small rebellion against order. My hands moved without permission from my brain, adjusting and readjusting until the light fell in uneven strips across the floor, like prison bars made of shadow and gold. You have to understand I was different before. I noticed when milk was about to expire. I remembered birthdays and anniversary dates. I could tell you what I wore 3 Tuesdays ago. Now my memories feel like photographs left too long in sunlight, all the edges burned away, leaving only the essential shapes. A flickering light, uneven blinds, the absence of an envelope. The envelope bothers me most. Not because it was missing, but because I knew it would be missing before I looked. Like my mind had already accepted a reality where certain things simply don't exist anymore. Where mail arrives incomplete and no one questions the gaps. Where you adjust blinds to let in the wrong kind of light and call it normal. I started paying attention to mirrors after that, really looking, the way you look when you're trying to catch yourself lying. My reflection seemed delayed just by a fraction of a second, like watching a movie where the audio doesn't quite sync with the picture. I'd raise my hand and watch my reflection follow a heartbeat too late, smile and see the echo of it ripple across the glass. Or maybe I was the echo. The thought came to me one morning while brushing my teeth. What if the person in the mirror was the real one and I was just the delayed response? What if I'd been living my life a split second behind myself, always catching up to moments that had already passed? I stopped looking in mirrors for a while after that. But you can't avoid them forever. They're everywhere: bathroom cabinets, storefront windows, the black screen of your phone when it goes dark. And each time I caught my reflection, it seemed a little more distant, like looking at someone who used to be me, who remembered being me, but wasn't quite sure how to wear my face anymore. People started noticing too, not the mirror thing, how could they, but something. The woman at the coffee shop where I'd been going for 3 years suddenly asked if I was new to the area. My neighbor, the one who always waved from her garden, looked right through me like I was made of glass. Even my own mother hesitated for a moment when I called, asking, "Who is this?" in a voice that suggested she genuinely wasn't sure. I told myself it was coincidence, stress. People are distracted these days, everyone's half present, half somewhere else. But deep down, in that place where you keep your most honest thoughts, I knew something fundamental had shifted. Like I'd stepped slightly to the left of my own life and couldn't find my way back. The humming got louder. Nights became impossible. I'd lie in bed listening to that sound behind my ear, watching shadows move across the ceiling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Sometimes I'd catch myself holding my breath, waiting for something, what I couldn't say, a voice maybe, a sign, some indication that whatever had started that night was finished with me. But it wasn't finished. If anything, it was just beginning. I started leaving things deliberately out of place. Not just blinds, books turned backwards on shelves, shoes on the wrong feet, clocks set 5 minutes fast, small rebellions against the order I'd once craved. It felt important somehow, like I was marking a trail for someone who might need to follow. Or maybe I was just trying to prove I still existed, still had the power to change things, even if those things were tiny and meaningless. The dreams were the worst part. I'd find myself standing in that hallway again, watching the light flicker in its patient, irregular rhythm. The mail would be there, perfectly stacked except for the missing envelope, and I'd know with the certainty that only comes in dreams that the envelope contained something meant for me, something I'd been waiting for without realizing I was waiting. But every time I reached for the pile, my hand would pass right through it, like trying to grasp smoke or hold onto water. I'd wake up with my fingers still grasping at nothing, the taste of disappointment sharp on my tongue. You probably think I should have seen someone, a doctor, a therapist, someone with degrees and explanations and little white pills that promise to make the world make sense again. But how do you explain that you've become translucent to your own life, that you're living in the margins of your own existence? Besides, I wasn't sure I wanted it to stop. There was something almost peaceful about fading, like slowly turning down the volume on a song that had been playing too loud for too long. The world became softer around the edges, less insistent. Colors seemed deeper, sounds more layered. I could sit for hours just listening to the way air moved through the room, feeling the weight of dust settling on surfaces, watching light crawl across walls like something alive. Maybe this is what letting go actually feels like, not the dramatic surrender you see in movies, but a gradual loosening of your grip on the solid world, a slow recognition that you were never as firmly planted as you thought. The humming has become a comfort now, like having a secret companion, something that knows me better than I know myself. Sometimes I hum along with it, and for those moments everything feels aligned. The mirrors show me my face without delay. The shadows fall where they should. The world remembers my name. But those moments never last. I'm writing this because I think I understand now. That envelope, the one that was always missing, it was meant for the person I used to be. The one who straightened blinds and noticed expiration dates and showed up clearly in photographs. But that person has been slowly dissolving like sugar in rain, and what's left doesn't have a mailing address anymore. I'm not disappearing exactly, I'm just becoming optional, a possibility rather than a certainty, and maybe that's okay. Maybe some of us are meant to live in the spaces between things, in the pauses between heartbeats, in the flicker between light and dark. The blinds are crooked again. I can see the uneven light from where I sit, writing these words that feel like releasing balloons into an empty sky. I won't straighten them this time. Let them hang however they want. Let the light fall where it may. If you're reading this, it means you found the letter I never sent. Maybe you're the person who was supposed to receive that missing envelope all along. Maybe you'll understand what I'm too tired to explain. Or maybe you'll just think I lost my mind in the space between adjusting blinds and accepting their imperfection. Either way, it doesn't matter now. The humming is getting softer, or maybe I'm just getting better at listening to it. My reflection in the window beside me looks almost peaceful, though I can't be sure if it's really mine anymore. The person looking back seems to know something I don't, some secret about letting go that I'm only just beginning to learn. I should probably warn you about something. If you start noticing things, flickering lights, missing mail, the way your reflection seems just slightly off, don't try to fix it. Don't straighten what wants to be crooked. Don't look for what's meant to be missing. Just adjust the blinds to let in the wrong kind of light and see what happens. The world is stranger and more forgiving than we think. There's room in it for people like me, people who exist in the margins, in the almost but not quite spaces. We're the ones who make sure the blinds stay uneven, who remember the weight of missing envelopes, who keep the lights flickering at just the right intervals. We're still here even when we're not. Especially then. Story 2. I had been watching the floorboards, eyes tracing the familiar lines where the wood met the wall. The shadows didn't shift, but something in the air felt charged, like a held breath. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the windows, a soft murmur that might have been mistaken for an echo. Each tick of the ceiling fan seemed amplified, its rhythm oddly irregular. My gaze caught the edge of the bookshelf, where the dust had settled uniformly, untouched. Yet something had changed, an inexplicable lightness in the room. That's when I noticed the single bookmark lying on the floor, and that it was never mine. The bookmark was pale blue, paper thin. When I picked it up, my fingertips went cold, though the room was warm. The texture felt wrong, too smooth, like touching water that had somehow kept its shape. I don't remember books in that room. I don't remember reading anything for weeks before that moment. But there it was, and my hand was reaching for it before my mind caught up. Sleep has been different since then, not absent, but layered. I drift down through levels that don't feel like rest. Sometimes I wake with the taste of copper on my tongue, though I haven't bitten anything. Sometimes the sheets are damp with sweat that smells like ozone, sharp and clean in a way that makes my teeth ache. The humming started 3 nights after I found the bookmark. Low frequency, so low I felt it in my chest before I heard it. It would begin around the time when darkness settled completely, when the last traces of sunset faded from the western windows. The sound seemed to come from beneath the house, or maybe from inside the walls themselves. When I pressed my ear to the floor, the humming stopped. When I pulled away, it resumed, patient as breathing. There were lights behind the trees. The kitchen faucet drips now in a pattern I've started to recognize. 3 quick drops, pause, 2 drops, longer pause, then a single drop that seems to hang in the air before falling. I've tightened the handle until my knuckles went white, but the rhythm continues. The water tastes metallic, like I'm drinking from a handful of coins. I found myself standing in the hallway again last night, bare feet on the cold hardwood, staring at the door to the basement. It was open just a crack, though I'm certain I never go down there. The air coming up from below carried that same ozone smell, mixed with something else, something organic and warm. The floorboards around the door frame are lighter than the rest, as if they've been bleached by whatever light seeps up from below. The bookmark is still in my pocket. I check for it constantly now, running my thumb across its impossible smoothness. Sometimes it feels warm. Sometimes it pulses like a second heartbeat, syncing with the rhythm of that deep humming that follows me through the house. I don't remember ever coming back. Time moves strangely in the afternoon hours. I'll look at the clock and see 2:30, then blink and find it's still 2:30, though the shadows have shifted across the floor in ways that suggest hours have passed. The light during these suspended moments takes on a quality I can't name. Too white, but somehow also too warm, like staring into the heart of something that isn't quite fire. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looks tired, but tired in the wrong places. The skin beneath my eyes is clear, unmarked by sleeplessness, but there's an exhaustion in my pupils that goes deeper than fatigue. When I lean closer to the glass, my breath doesn't fog the surface the way it should. The mirror stays clear, as if the air leaving my lungs has no warmth to give. The humming is louder tonight. I've started leaving lights on, but they flicker at moments that feel significant, though I can't grasp why. The bulb in the living room dims whenever I think about the basement door. The kitchen fluorescent stutters when I hold the bookmark too tightly. These aren't the random failures of old wiring. There's intention in the timing, a responsiveness that makes my skin crawl with the certainty that something is paying attention. The noise didn't come from outside. Sleep, when it comes, brings dreams that feel more like memories of dreams. I'm walking through rooms that might be my house, but the proportions are wrong. Hallways stretch longer than they should. Ceilings press lower than physics would allow. In these dreams, I'm always moving towards something, drawn by a pull I can't resist and don't understand. The bookmark grows warm in my pocket as I walk through these impossible spaces. Sometimes I take it out and find it glowing with that same too white, too warm light. The illumination doesn't cast shadows the way light should. Instead, it seems to erase them, leaving everything flat and borderless, like looking at the world through overexposed film. I wake from these dreams with the taste of copper stronger than before, and sometimes there are marks on my arms. Not bruises or cuts, but impressions, as if someone has pressed their fingers into my skin with just enough pressure to leave temporary indentations. The marks fade within an hour, but while they're there, they tingle with a sensation like mild electric current. The basement door was wider open this morning. I stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into darkness that seemed thicker than it should be. The air rising from below carried new scents mixed with the familiar ozone, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Something else that reminded me of the way metal tastes when you hold it between your teeth. 3 steps down, the wood felt different under my feet, softer, almost spongy, though it looked the same as always. 6 steps down, the humming grew loud enough that I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through my ribs and into my heart. 9 steps down, the darkness ahead began to show variations, subtle gradations that suggested space and structure without revealing what filled that space. I don't remember climbing back up. The bookmark was hot in my pocket when I found myself in the kitchen again, staring at the faucet as it continued its patient drip. 3 drops, pause, 2 drops, pause, 1 drop that seemed to hover in the air like a small planet before gravity claimed it. My reflection in the window above the sink looked back at me with eyes that held knowledge I couldn't access, as if some part of me had learned something the rest couldn't remember. The humming follows me now during daylight hours. It's fainter when the sun is high, but it never completely disappears. I hear it beneath the sound of traffic, woven into the white noise of air conditioning, hiding in the spaces between my own heartbeats. The frequency has changed, become more complex. What started as a single low tone now carries harmonics, overtones that create patterns my mind tries to interpret as meaning. Sometimes I catch myself humming along without realizing it. The sound emerges from my throat unbidden, my vocal cords finding the precise pitch to match whatever force generates that endless drone. When I notice and stop, the silence that follows feels aggressive, like a held breath before a scream. There were lights behind the trees, and they were moving. The bookmark has begun to change. The pale blue color deepens in certain light, shifting towards shades that don't exist in any spectrum I recognize. When I hold it up to windows, it doesn't block the light so much as transform it, filtering ordinary sunshine into something that makes my eyes water and my skin prickle with anticipation. I've started finding other things, small objects that don't belong, scattered through the house like breadcrumbs marking a trail I don't remember walking. A button made from material that feels like metal but bends like fabric. A coin with symbols that hurt to look at directly. A key that's warm to the touch and fits no lock I can find, though I'm compelled to keep trying doors and drawers and boxes, searching for whatever it might open. The mirror in the bathroom shows me things now. Not different reflections exactly, but reflections with additional information. I see myself as I am, but I also see shadows that suggest where I've been, faint afterimages that linger at the edges of my reflection like double-exposed photographs. Sometimes these shadow selves are in positions I don't remember taking, reaching for things I don't remember touching, looking toward corners of the room where nothing waits. The water from the faucet has started to taste like memory. Each sip carries flavors I can't identify but somehow recognize, like tasting foods from dreams or childhood moments that might never have happened. The metallic undertone has grown stronger, but it's accompanied now by sweetness that coats my teeth and makes me thirsty for more. I don't remember ever coming back, but something did. The basement door stands fully open now. I didn't open it. I avoid that hallway when possible, but the house seems to shift when I'm not paying attention, rearranging itself so that all paths lead eventually to that doorway, and the stairs descending into darkness that hums with patient invitation. The smell rising from below has grown stronger, ozone and metal and dying flowers, but also something else now. Something that reminds me of the way air smells just before lightning strikes, charged with potential and danger and the promise of transformation. When I breathe too deeply near the basement door, my lungs tingle and my vision shifts, colors becoming more saturated while edges lose their definition. Time has started folding in on itself. I'll be washing dishes and suddenly I'm drying the same plate I dried an hour ago, though I don't remember washing it again. I'll walk from the kitchen to the living room and arrive to find evidence of conversations I don't remember having, books open to pages I don't remember reading, the television tuned to channels that broadcast nothing but static that sounds almost like voices speaking in languages that tickle the edges of recognition. The bookmark pulses now in rhythm with my heartbeat, but sometimes my heartbeat changes to match its rhythm instead. During these moments, I feel connected to something vast and patient, something that has been waiting for longer than I can comprehend. The connection brings a kind of peace, but it's the peace of surrender, of finally stopping a struggle I didn't know I was fighting. The lights behind the trees were moving in patterns. My dreams have become more vivid, more persistent. I walk through versions of my house where every room connects to the basement, where the stairs descend not into darkness but into spaces filled with that impossible light. In these dreams, I'm not afraid. I'm curious, eager, drawn forward by the promise of understanding something that waking mind can't grasp. The bookmark in dream hands feels alive, warm and responsive, like holding a small animal. It guides me through the transformed house, leading me toward chambers that exist in no architecture I've ever seen. The walls breathe. The floors pulse with circulation that might be blood or might be light flowing through veins of living wood and stone. I wake from these dreams reluctantly, clinging to the fading images like trying to hold water in cupped palms. The waking world feels thin by comparison, insubstantial, like a photograph of reality rather than reality itself. The copper taste in my mouth has become something I crave rather than endure. The humming has harmonies now that sound like voices. Not words exactly, but vocal sounds that carry meaning below the threshold of language. The tones rise and fall in patterns that feel like conversation, like being spoken to in a dialect I almost remember learning. When I listen carefully, pressing my ear to walls or floors or the surface of mirrors, I can almost distinguish individual voices within the harmonic blend. Sometimes I find myself responding, making sounds that aren't quite words but feel like answers. My throat produces frequencies I didn't know I could generate, tones that resonate in my chest and skull, until the boundaries between my voice and the house's voice blur into a single sustained note that seems to go on forever. The basement door is singing. Not the door itself, but the space beyond it. The darkness has found its voice, and that voice is beautiful in ways that make my eyes fill with tears I don't understand. The melody is complex, layered, built from harmonies that include the humming I've grown to love and new frequencies that speak directly to parts of my mind that have no names. I've started spending time at the top of the stairs, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, listening to the music that rises from below. The bookmark grows warm in my pocket during these sessions, sometimes hot enough that I have to shift it from hand to hand to avoid burning my fingers. But I don't let go. I can't let go. The music is teaching me things. Not facts or information, but ways of being, ways of existing that don't fit into the narrow channels of ordinary consciousness. I'm learning to see colors that have no names, to feel textures that exist only in the spaces between atoms, to taste emotions and hear the flavors of thoughts that aren't my own. The mirror in the bathroom now shows me rooms I've never seen, landscapes that exist nowhere on any map I know. Sometimes my reflection walks through these impossible places while my body remains motionless before the glass. I watch myself explore chambers filled with that breathing light, corridors that stretch beyond the horizon, spaces where geometry follows rules that make perfect sense until I try to remember them. I don't remember ever coming back, but I remember going. The memory surfaces in fragments like pieces of a puzzle scattered across time. I remember the basement stairs feeling different under my feet, each step taking me not just down but elsewhere, into spaces that exist adjacent to the house rather than beneath it. I remember the darkness welcoming me, wrapping around my shoulders like a warm coat made of midnight and possibility. I remember the light that wasn't light, the illumination that came from everywhere and nowhere, revealing shapes and structures that my mind interpreted as familiar even though they followed no earthly logic. I remember voices that spoke without words, communication that bypassed language entirely, and planted understanding directly into the soil of consciousness. I remember not wanting to leave. The bookmark was a gift, though I don't remember receiving it. It was placed in my hand by fingers that felt like mine, but belonged to someone else, someone who might have been me in a place where identity flows like water between containers. The pale blue color held depths that contained entire worlds, entire ways of being that called to parts of me I'd forgotten I possessed. But I came back, or was sent back, or was never really gone at all, just visiting while my body waited in rooms that suddenly felt too small, too limited, too bound by rules that no longer seemed necessary or even real. The house remembers what I've forgotten. Every surface holds traces of my journey, impressions left by footsteps that walked through dimensions folded inside the space between seconds. The walls hum with frequencies I brought back like souvenirs, vibrations that bridge the gap between here and there, between what was and what could be. The basement door stands open because something in me never really returned, some essential part that remains in those breathing chambers, those spaces where light lives and darkness sings. What came back was incomplete, a partial self that functions in this narrow reality while dreaming constantly of the broader existence that waits just beyond the reach of ordinary perception. The humming is calling me home. Not to this house, but to the spaces within spaces, the rooms that exist in the margins of reality where possibility hasn't yet collapsed into the limited forms that define this world. The bookmark pulses with invitation, warm against my skin like a second heart that beats in rhythm with forces I can feel but not name. I stand at the top of the basement stairs again, listening to music that comes from everywhere at once. The darkness below shimmers with potential, with the promise of returning to a place where I was more than I am here, where consciousness expands beyond the narrow channels of individual identity into something vast and connected and beautifully, terrifyingly alive. The lights behind the trees were moving in patterns that spelled my name. I had been watching the floorboards, eyes tracing the familiar lines where the wood met the wall. The shadows didn't shift, but something in the air felt charged, like a held breath. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the windows, a soft murmur that might have been mistaken for an echo. Each tick of the ceiling fan seemed amplified, its rhythm oddly irregular. The bookmark is still in my pocket, warm and patient as a promise waiting to be kept. Story 3. It wasn't the first time the window was open in the morning. The curtains barely shifted, hanging more out of habit than function. A stray leaf lay on the floor, despite the room being sealed tight the night before. I swept it into the bin without a second thought. The air felt a touch cooler, but the thermostat showed no change. I straightened the cushions on the couch, noting the slight indentation in one of them. The remote control was exactly where it should have been, untouched since yesterday. When I left the room, I made sure to close the door softly. I didn't mind if it stayed ajar. I've been sitting here for hours now, staring at this blank page, trying to find the right words. My hands shake a little when I think about typing what really happened. It's been years since I left that house, years since I moved across the country to this small apartment where nobody knows my name or asks questions about where I came from. I told myself I'd never talk about it, never write it down, never give it that kind of power over me again. But I can't sleep anymore, not properly, and I keep finding things in the morning that shouldn't be there. Small things, a book moved from one shelf to another, a glass of water I don't remember pouring. The taste of metal in my mouth when I wake up, sweet and sharp like old pennies left in the sun. So I'm going to tell you what happened in that house. Maybe if I get it all out, maybe if someone else knows, it'll finally let me go. The house was supposed to be temporary, just a place to stay while I figured out what came next after the divorce. My cousin knew someone who knew someone, and they had this old place sitting empty for months. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled like vanilla and old wood hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places. It felt safe, normal, the kind of house where families raised children and celebrated birthdays and argued about whose turn it was to take out the trash. I moved in on a Tuesday. The weather was mild, the kind of day where you leave the windows open and let the breeze carry away all the stale air from rooms that have been closed too long. I remember unpacking my boxes in the living room, the afternoon light streaming through those same curtains that barely moved. Everything felt possible then. I was starting over, and this house was going to be my sanctuary while I rebuilt my life. The first week passed without incident. I fell into a routine quickly. Coffee in the morning by the kitchen window, watching the neighbor's cat patrol the fence line. Long walks in the evening through the quiet streets. I'd come home, make dinner, read a book, go to bed. Simple, peaceful, exactly what I needed. But by the second week, I started noticing little things that didn't quite fit. The television would be warm in the morning, as if it had been on all night, but I always turned it off before bed. I was careful about things like that, conscious of the electric bill and the waste of leaving things running. I'd check the power button twice, watch the little red light fade to black, then head upstairs. But morning after morning, I'd come down to find the screen dark, but the back of the set radiating heat like it had been working hard while I slept. I told myself it was probably just some kind of energy-saving mode I didn't understand. Modern electronics were complicated. Maybe it was downloading updates or running some background process. I didn't think much of it then. I should have. The humming started around the same time, just a low, almost inaudible sound that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. At first I thought it might be the refrigerator or the air conditioning, but it happened even when those weren't running. It was the kind of sound you feel more than hear, a vibration that settled into your chest and made your teeth ache slightly. I'd walk through the house trying to locate the source, pressing my ear to different walls, but it always seemed to be coming from somewhere else, always just out of reach. I called the landlord about it. He said old houses made all kinds of noises, settling and shifting with the weather, pipes expanding and contracting, nothing to worry about. His voice had this dismissive quality that made me feel foolish for even asking, so I stopped asking. The nights grew longer and I found myself staying up later and later, not because I wasn't tired, but because something felt different once the sun went down. The house seemed to hold its breath after dark, like it was waiting for something. I'd sit in the living room with a book, but I couldn't concentrate on the words. My eyes kept drifting to the windows, to the dark spaces between the furniture, to the doorway that led to the hall. That's when I started noticing the reflections. There was a mirror in the hallway, one of those old oval ones with a brass frame that had probably been there for decades. During the day it was perfectly normal, showing exactly what you'd expect. But at night, especially when the only light came from the living room lamp, something was off about it. The reflection didn't quite match my movements. It was subtle, like a delay of maybe half a second, as if the mirror was showing me what I had done rather than what I was doing. I tested it one night, standing directly in front of the mirror and raising my hand. My reflection raised its hand too, but I swear there was a pause, a moment where I was moving and it wasn't. I waved. It waved back, but the rhythm was wrong, like an echo that couldn't quite keep up. I avoided the hallway after that, taking the long way around to get to the stairs. But that only made things worse, because now I was thinking about it constantly. Every time I glimpsed the mirror from the corner of my eye, I expected to see something that shouldn't be there, and the expectation was almost worse than the reality. The sweet metallic smell started appearing around this time too. It would hit me suddenly, usually when I was doing something mundane like washing dishes or folding laundry. The scent was distinctive, like copper mixed with something floral, almost pleasant at first, but quickly becoming cloying and wrong. It never lasted long, just a few seconds, but it left me feeling nauseated and dizzy. I searched the house for the source. I checked under the sinks for leaks, examined the walls for mold, even called a plumber to inspect the pipes. Nothing. The smell came and went as it pleased, and I began to associate it with the feeling of being watched. Because by then I was certain something was watching me. It started as just a prickle on the back of my neck, the way you feel when someone's staring at you in a crowded room. But this was constant, a low-level awareness that I was not alone even when I very clearly was. I'd spin around suddenly, expecting to catch a glimpse of whatever was behind me, but there was never anything there. Just empty rooms and shadows that fell exactly where they should. The feeling was strongest near electronic devices. The television, the microwave, the radio I kept on the kitchen counter. Whenever I got close to them, my skin would break out in goosebumps and my chest would tighten like someone was pressing down on my ribs. The devices themselves seemed to respond to my presence too. The TV would flicker when I walked past. The microwave clock would reset itself to midnight. The radio would tune itself to stations that played nothing but static, soft white noise that somehow felt hostile. I unplugged everything I could, but it didn't help. Even without power, the devices seemed to maintain some kind of awareness, some connection to whatever was happening in that house. I'd catch myself holding my breath when I walked through the kitchen, as if making too much noise would draw unwanted attention. Sleep became impossible, not because I wasn't tired, but because every time I closed my eyes, I could hear things moving downstairs. Soft footsteps on the hardwood floors, the creak of the couch springs as if someone had just sat down, the whisper of curtains being drawn back from windows. I'd lie in bed, paralyzed, listening to the sounds of someone living in my house while I tried to sleep. But whenever I got up to investigate, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The living room empty and still, the curtains hanging motionless, the couch cushions showing no sign of disturbance. I'd stand there in my pajamas, feeling foolish and frightened in equal measure, before trudging back upstairs to lie awake until dawn. The breaking point came on a night when the humming grew so loud I could no longer pretend it was just the house settling. I was in bed staring at the ceiling when the sound began to rise in pitch. What had been a barely perceptible vibration became a clear, sustained tone, like someone holding down a key on an electronic organ. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating through the walls, the floor, even the air itself. My teeth began to chatter, not from cold, but from the vibration running through my skull. I got up and followed the sound downstairs, my bare feet silent on the wooden steps. The humming grew stronger as I approached the living room, and I could see a faint white light flickering under the door. Not the warm yellow glow of a lamp, but something cold and harsh, like fluorescent lighting in an empty office building. I pressed my ear to the door and heard something that made my blood freeze. Breathing slow, deliberate breaths that didn't match the rhythm of the humming. Someone was in there, sitting in my living room, breathing in time with their own heartbeat, while that electronic tone filled the air around them. I should have called the police. I should have run outside and screamed for help. Instead, I found myself turning the doorknob with trembling fingers, pushing the door open just enough to peer inside. The room was empty, but the television was on, showing nothing but bright white static that filled the space with that cold, harsh light. The humming was coming from the speakers, a perfect sine wave that hurt to listen to. And there on the couch was the clear impression of someone sitting, the cushions compressed as if under the weight of an invisible body. As I watched, the impression shifted slightly, as if whoever was sitting there had just leaned forward. The humming changed pitch, rising higher, and I caught that sweet metallic smell again, so strong now it made my eyes water. The static on the television began to swirl, forming patterns that almost looked like a face, features that appeared and disappeared faster than I could focus on them. I slammed the door and ran back upstairs, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I locked myself in the bedroom and didn't come out until morning, when the humming finally stopped and the house fell silent again. The next day I packed everything I owned into my car and drove away. I didn't give notice to the landlord. I didn't clean the house or turn in the keys. I just left, driving until I reached this city where nobody knows me and nobody asks questions about why I sometimes wake up screaming. But leaving didn't fix anything. If anything, it made things worse, because now I know that whatever was in that house wasn't tied to the location. It was tied to me. The signs are subtler now, but they're still there. Electronics still behave strangely around me. I go through phones and laptops faster than anyone should, wearing them out with some kind of electromagnetic interference I can't explain. Mirrors still show that slight delay, that half-second pause that makes me question what I'm really seeing. And the sweet metallic smell appears without warning, usually when I'm alone and feeling safe. I've tried to tell myself it's all in my head, that the stress of the divorce and the move and starting over just broke something in my brain that makes me see patterns where none exist. But deep down, I know better. I know that something found me in that house, something that decided I was worth following, worth keeping close. The worst part is the certainty that it's still watching. When I'm typing this, I can feel it reading over my shoulder. When I'm trying to sleep, I can sense it settling into the empty space beside me on the bed. It's patient now, content to wait and observe, but I know it's there. I'll always know it's there. I thought telling this story would help, that getting it all out would somehow break the connection. But as I reach the end, as I prepare to hit save and close this document, I realize I've made a mistake, because now you know too. And I have the terrible feeling that knowing is all it takes, that by reading these words, you've opened the same door I opened in that house. I'm sorry, I'm so very sorry, but I couldn't carry this alone anymore. Check your mirrors tonight, listen for the humming, and if you smell something sweet and metallic when there's no reason for it, remember that some things can't be left behind, no matter how far you run. Story 4. I'm sitting here now, staring at the inventory report in my hands, and I know it's over. The numbers match perfectly. Every barcode scanned, every item accounted for, temperature readings stable as they've always been. The dust in the corners tells the story of a place left undisturbed, and that unopened delivery by the entrance looks exactly like what it claims to be just another routine shipment that arrived without the right paperwork. The lights work fine, though that power indicator keeps flickering the way old equipment does. Motion sensors show nothing because there's nothing to show. The air vent hums its mechanical tune, and the security footage loops back exactly 2 minutes because that's what the system was designed to do. Everything is normal, everything is as it should be, and that's how I know I've lost. The thing is, I remember when I first noticed the footage looping. I was standing right where I am now, clipboard in hand, watching the monitor cycle through its predetermined sequence. 2 minutes of recorded time, then back to the beginning. The timestamp would reset, the same empty corridor would appear, the same shadows would fall across the same boxes. I thought it was a glitch then, something technical that needed fixing. I even made a note to call maintenance. But before I could pick up the phone, I realized I was watching myself on the screen. Not me from that moment, but me from earlier, moving through the warehouse with that same clipboard, checking those same items. The figure on the monitor moved with my exact gait, paused at the same spots where I had paused, tilted its head the same way I tilt mine when I'm concentrating. The loop wasn't showing an empty warehouse at all. It was showing me over and over, performing the same inspection routine. I watched myself on that screen for what felt like hours, though the clock on the wall never seemed to move. The me on the monitor would walk the same path, scan the same items, make the same marks on the same forms, and every 2 minutes it would start again. I began to notice details I hadn't seen before, the way my shoulders hunched slightly when I reached the third aisle, how I always touched the wall at the same spot when turning the corner, the exact angle of my head when I looked up at the security camera. The strangest part was that I could feel myself doing these things as I watched. My shoulders would hunch in sync with the figure on screen. My hand would reach toward the wall at precisely the same moment. It was like watching a movie of myself while simultaneously living it, the boundary between observation and experience dissolving until I couldn't tell which version was real. That's when I started paying attention to the air vent. The hum had always been there, constant and unremarkable, the kind of background noise you stop hearing after a while. But watching that loop, I began to notice it wasn't quite constant. There were subtle variations in pitch, tiny fluctuations that seemed to correspond with my movements. When I walked toward the back of the warehouse, the hum would deepen slightly. When I turned left instead of right, it would rise half a tone. It was responding to me, or I was responding to it. The distinction didn't seem to matter anymore. I remember the moment I decided to test it. I stepped deliberately to the left and the hum shifted. I raised my arm and the sound grew slightly louder. I tried to move in a way I hadn't moved before, to break the pattern I'd been following, but my body seemed to know only one way through the space. My feet found the same path, my eyes focused on the same points, my hands reached for the same items in the same order. The motion sensors never registered any of this. According to them, the warehouse remained empty, untouched, a sterile space where nothing ever happened. But I could feel my presence in the room like a weight, heavy and persistent. Every step I took seemed to leave an impression that lasted longer than it should. Every breath I drew seemed to displace air that took too long to settle back into place. Before that, I had been focused on the power indicator. That irregular flickering had caught my attention because everything else in the warehouse was so precisely controlled. Temperature steady, lighting consistent, airflow regulated, but that one small light would dim and brighten with no apparent pattern, like a heartbeat with an irregular rhythm. I started timing the flickers, thinking I might find some correlation with the building's electrical systems or the equipment cycles. But the pattern seemed random until I realized I was looking at it wrong. It wasn't irregular at all. It was responding to something I couldn't see, marking time according to some schedule I didn't understand. The flickers came faster when I was near the unopened delivery, slower when I moved toward the back of the warehouse. They would pause entirely when I stood in certain spots, as if holding their breath, waiting for me to move on. I began to think of that little light as the warehouse's way of watching me, its mechanical eye tracking my progress through the space. I had walked past that delivery so many times without really seeing it. Just another box among hundreds, waiting to be processed and shelved. The paperwork discrepancy was minor, the kind of administrative oversight that happened regularly. Someone had forgotten to update the dispatch record, or the system had failed to sync properly. Nothing unusual about that. But the box itself was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. It was the right size, the right shape, bore the correct shipping labels and handling instructions. Yet it seemed to occupy more space than its dimensions suggested, casting shadows that extended further than they should, creating a sense of presence that made me want to walk around it rather than past it. I found myself avoiding that corner of the warehouse, taking longer routes to reach the same destinations. When I had to pass near it, I would look away, focus on my clipboard or the shelves or anything else that might distract me from the growing certainty that the box was somehow aware of my presence. The weight of it seemed wrong too. Not that I had lifted it, I wouldn't have done that without proper authorization, but I could sense its mass in the way it sat on the floor, the slight depression it made in the concrete, the way the air seemed denser around it. It was either much heavier or much lighter than it appeared, and both possibilities disturbed me equally. Going back further, I remember when the exit routes were still clear, all of them marked with bright signs and emergency lighting, paths I had walked countless times during routine safety checks. The doors opened smoothly, the corridors were unobstructed, everything met code requirements perfectly. But I had stopped using them, not consciously, not as a deliberate decision, but I found myself avoiding the exits without really understanding why. I would plan to leave through the main door, then find myself taking a detour that led me back into the warehouse. I would head for the emergency exit, then remember some task that needed completing first, some item that required double checking. The routes themselves began to feel wrong, as if they led somewhere other than outside. The familiar hallways seemed longer than they used to be, the turns more frequent, the lighting dimmer despite the bulbs burning as brightly as ever. I would start down a corridor I had used hundreds of times before and find myself uncertain of where it would lead, doubting my memory of the building's layout. Eventually, I stopped trying to leave at all. It seemed easier to stay, to continue with the inventory, to focus on the work that needed doing. There would be time to go later, when everything was properly accounted for, when all the numbers matched and all the forms were complete. Before all of that, the lights had functioned perfectly. Bright, even illumination throughout the warehouse, no dark corners or shadowed areas where mistakes might be made or items might be overlooked. The electrical system was new, installed according to the latest efficiency standards, designed to provide optimal working conditions. But the light itself had begun to feel thick, viscous, like something I had to move through rather than something that simply surrounded me. It clung to surfaces differently than it used to, creating reflections where none should exist, casting my shadow in directions that didn't align with the position of the fixtures. I started to notice that my shadow was always slightly behind me, as if the light took a moment longer to register my presence, to acknowledge that I had moved from one position to another. When I raised my hand, the shadow would follow a fraction of a second later. When I turned my head, the shadow would complete the motion just after I had finished it. This delay grew longer over time, until my shadow seemed to be performing a completely different set of actions, moving through a slightly different version of the warehouse where the same tasks were being completed, but in a different order with different timing, according to different priorities. The temperature controls had been my first sign that something was changing. They showed perfect stability, exactly as they were programmed to do, maintaining the precise climate necessary for proper storage conditions. The digital readouts never varied, the sensors reported consistent conditions throughout the space, the system logs showed no irregularities or fluctuations. But I could feel the cold, not the controlled, regulated coolness of proper climate management, but something deeper and more persistent. It seemed to rise from the floor, seeping through the concrete and settling in the lower areas of the warehouse like invisible fog. My breath never showed, the thermometers never registered it, but the cold was there nonetheless, growing stronger each time I completed another circuit of the space. It was the kind of cold that made me want to move constantly, to keep checking and rechecking the same items, to maintain the rhythm of activity that seemed to be the only thing keeping it at bay. When I stood still for too long, I could feel it gathering around my feet, climbing slowly up my legs, settling into my bones with a patience that suggested it had all the time in the world. The scanning devices had shown all items present and accounted for from the very beginning. Every barcode registered properly, every database entry matched its physical counterpart, every quantity aligned with the digital records. The system was working exactly as intended, providing accurate, real-time inventory data with no discrepancies or errors. But I kept scanning the same items over and over again, not because the first scan had failed, but because I couldn't remember completing it. I would approach a shelf, raise the scanner, hear the familiar beep of successful registration, then find myself approaching the same shelf again moments later with no recollection of having been there before. The items themselves seemed to shift slightly between scans. Not their positions, those remained constant, but their significance, their weight in the overall inventory, their relationship to the items around them. A box that had seemed routine during the first scan would appear somehow crucial during the second, as if its contents had changed or its purpose had been redefined while I wasn't looking. I began to understand that the scanning wasn't really about inventory control. It was about something else, some other kind of accounting that had nothing to do with the items on the shelves and everything to do with my presence in the space, my movement through the predetermined paths, my participation in whatever process was actually taking place. The rows of identical boxes had been there when I first entered, perfectly aligned, properly labeled, arranged according to the systematic organization that made the warehouse function efficiently. Each box was identical to its neighbors, part of a larger pattern that extended throughout the facility, creating the orderly environment necessary for accurate inventory management. But as I moved among them, I began to notice that the pattern was too perfect. Not just well organized, but mathematically precise in ways that seemed unnecessary for simple storage. The spacing between boxes was exactly uniform. The height of each stack was identical to every other stack. The angles of the labels were aligned to the degree. More disturbing was the realization that I fit into this pattern. My movements through the warehouse followed the same mathematical precision, my steps falling at exactly the right intervals, my turns occurring at precisely the correct angles. I was part of the organization, another element in the systematic arrangement, as carefully positioned as any of the boxes on the shelves. When I tried to deviate from the pattern, to walk differently or pause in unexpected places, I found that I couldn't. My body knew where it needed to be and when it needed to be there. My hands reached for the right items at the right moments. My eyes focused on the correct points of reference without conscious direction. I was becoming indistinguishable from the boxes themselves, identical, predictable, properly positioned within the larger system. And before all of that, there had been the moment I first walked into the warehouse that day. Just another routine inventory check, the kind of task I had performed countless times before. I had picked up my clipboard, checked my scanner, reviewed the digital records that would guide my work. Everything was normal, familiar, exactly as it should be. But as I stepped through the entrance, I felt something settle over me like a weight I couldn't see. Not uncomfortable exactly, but present in a way that made me aware of my own body, my own breathing, my own heartbeat in ways I usually wasn't. It was as if the warehouse was taking my measure, learning the shape and rhythm of my presence. I should have left then. Some part of me knew that whatever was about to happen had already been set in motion, that I was walking into something that had been prepared specifically for me. But the work needed to be done, the inventory needed to be completed, and there was no rational reason to turn around and walk away. So I stayed. I picked up my scanner, consulted my clipboard, and began the routine I had performed so many times before. I walked toward the first row of boxes, raised my hand to scan the first barcode, and took the first step into a process that I now understand was never about inventory at all. It was about something else entirely, something that needed me to be exactly where I was, doing exactly what I was doing, following exactly the path I would follow. Something that had been waiting patiently for me to arrive, to begin the sequence of actions that would lead me inevitably to this moment, sitting here with my completed report, knowing that everything is accounted for and nothing can ever be changed. The warehouse is empty now, according to all the instruments and systems designed to measure such things. But I'm still here, and I always will be, performing the same inventory check, following the same pattern, part of the same precise organization that makes everything function exactly as it was designed to do. The numbers match, every item is accounted for, the process is complete. And that's how I know it's just beginning. Story 5. I brushed the thin layer of dust from the tabletop and felt a chill run through my fingers. Each particle seemed to clamor for attention, betraying a presence that shouldn't have been. The creak of the wooden floor beneath me was only a shadow in my peripheral awareness. My skin rose with goosebumps as if the room exhaled a secret. The air tasted older, more muted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the dust carried stories I wasn't meant to hear. That memory comes back to me now, sitting here in this different place, thousands of miles from where it all happened. I've been carrying this story inside me for so long that it's become part of my breathing, part of the rhythm that keeps me awake at night. I told myself I'd never speak about it, told myself it would be better buried, forgotten, left to fade like old photographs in a drawer nobody opens anymore. But it hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown sharper with time, more insistent. So here I am, finally ready to let it out, though my voice feels strange in my throat, like I'm speaking a language I haven't used in years. Before everything changed, my life was beautifully ordinary. I was house-sitting for someone who'd gone away for an extended period, taking care of a place that sat alone at the end of a quiet road. The house was older but well-maintained, with large windows that let in streams of afternoon light and rooms that echoed just enough to make you aware of the space around you. I'd been there for weeks already, settling into a comfortable routine of morning coffee, afternoon walks, and evenings spent reading by the fireplace. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, I welcomed it. There's something cleansing about being alone with your thoughts, away from the constant hum of other people's lives. The nearest neighbor was far enough away that I could go days without seeing another soul, and that suited me perfectly. I'd wake up, tend to the small garden, maybe drive into town for supplies, then return to the peaceful quiet of the house. Everything felt normal those first few weeks, safe, predictable. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found such a perfect arrangement, a place where I could exist without the weight of expectations or obligations pressing down on me. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I almost dismissed it entirely. I was in the kitchen making lunch when I caught sight of something in my peripheral vision, a shadow that seemed to move independently of any object that should have cast it. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing there, just the familiar outline of furniture and the play of sunlight through the windows. I stood there for a moment, spatula in hand, waiting for my eyes to adjust or for some logical explanation to present itself. But the feeling lingered, that sensation when someone's watching you, that prickle of awareness that runs up your spine. It was like that, except there was no one there to be watching. I told myself it was just the adjustment of living in a new place, that unfamiliar houses always take time to feel completely comfortable. The mind plays tricks when you're somewhere different, creates patterns where none exist. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often after that, checking corners and doorways with a casualness I hoped would fool whatever part of my brain was generating these false alarms. The electronic devices started acting up around the same time, though I didn't immediately connect the two things. The radio in the kitchen would occasionally tune itself to stations I hadn't selected, filling the room with static or fragments of conversations in languages I couldn't identify. The first time it happened, I assumed I'd bumped the dial accidentally. The second time I checked the cord, thinking maybe there was a short in the wiring. By the third time, I was standing perfectly still in the doorway when the tuning knob began to turn on its own, slowly, deliberately, as if invisible fingers were searching for something specific. The sound that emerged wasn't quite music and wasn't quite voices. It was something in between, a low humming that seemed to vibrate not just through the speakers, but through the walls themselves. I unplugged the radio and left it silent for several days after that. Smell came next, sweet and metallic like copper pennies dissolved in honey. It would appear without warning, usually in the late afternoon when the light was starting to fade. I'd be reading or preparing dinner and suddenly the air would change, becoming thick with this cloying scent that made my mouth water and my stomach turn at the same time. I searched the house for the source, checking for gas leaks, spoiled food, anything that might explain it. But the smell never seemed to be coming from any particular place. It was just there, permeating everything, and then it would vanish as suddenly as it had arrived. Sleep became more difficult, not because of nightmares or obvious fears, but because of a persistent feeling that the house was more active at night than during the day. I'd lie in bed listening to sounds that might have been the normal settling of old wood and pipes, or might have been something else entirely. Footsteps that paused just outside my door, the soft whisper of curtains moving in rooms where I'd left the windows closed. I started keeping a small flashlight by the bed, though I told myself it was just a practical precaution. Old houses, power outages, better safe than sorry. But when I used it to investigate the sounds, the beam would catch glimpses of things that shouldn't have been there. Not objects exactly, but disturbances in the air itself, like heat shimmer on a summer road, except it was cool in the house and the disturbances moved with purpose. The mirrors began reflecting things that weren't in the room. I'd catch sight of movement in the bathroom mirror while brushing my teeth, turn to look behind me and find empty space. The reflection would show a figure standing in the doorway, but when I spun around, there was only the dark hallway. I started avoiding mirrors after dark, which meant navigating the house by feel and memory, hands trailing along walls that sometimes felt warmer or colder than they should have. My chest began to tighten whenever I was near anything electronic. The television, the microwave, even the simple digital clock by the bed would trigger a pressure in my lungs, as if the air around these devices had become thicker, harder to breathe. I found myself spending more time outside, walking the property line, sitting in the garden where the only technology was the distant hum of power lines overhead. But even outside, I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched had grown stronger, more persistent. I'd look up from weeding to find the windows of the house staring down at me like eyes, though I knew I'd left the curtains closed. Sometimes I'd see my own silhouette moving past the glass, even though I was clearly in the garden. The house seemed to be generating its own version of me, carrying on with some parallel routine I wasn't aware of. The moment everything crystallized, when I could no longer pretend these were just the quirks of an old house and an overactive imagination, happened on what I now think of as my last real day there. I was in the living room, reading by the window when the light began to change, not dimming as if clouds had passed over the sun, but shifting in quality, becoming whiter, more intense, like the light was being filtered through something I couldn't see. I looked up from my book and realized that my shadow on the wall didn't match my position. I was sitting upright, book in my lap, but my shadow was standing, arms raised above its head in a gesture I wasn't making. I moved my hand to test it, waved it back and forth, but the shadow remained frozen in its impossible posture. Then the humming started, not from the radio this time, but from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the air itself began to vibrate with a low frequency that I felt in my bones. The sweet metallic smell flooded the room so intensely that I could taste it on my tongue, and the pressure in my chest became so severe that I could barely draw breath. The shadow on the wall began to move independently, turning its head to look directly at me even though my own head remained perfectly still. Its mouth opened in what might have been a scream or a laugh, and the humming grew louder, more insistent, until I felt like my skull might crack from the pressure. I don't remember leaving the house. One moment I was frozen in that chair, watching my shadow perform its impossible dance, and the next I was standing in the driveway, car keys in my hand, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The sun was setting, which meant hours had passed, but it felt like only seconds. I drove away that night and never went back, never called to explain, never retrieved the few belongings I'd left behind. I just kept driving until I reached a city where I could lose myself among other people, other lives, other shadows that behaved the way shadows should. But distance hasn't helped the way I thought it would. The pressure in my chest returns whenever I'm near electronic devices. I still catch glimpses of movement in mirrors that doesn't belong to me. The sweet metallic smell appears without warning, usually in the late afternoon, and when it does, I know I'm not alone, even here, even now. My dreams are full of that house, but not as I remember it. In my dreams, it's still occupied. Someone who looks like me still lives there, still follows the routine I established all those months ago. Morning coffee, afternoon walks, evenings by the fireplace, but this other version of me never leaves, never drives away in panic, just continues the cycle day after day, while something watches from the shadows that don't match the light. I've tried to convince myself that I imagined it all, that isolation and unfamiliarity created a perfect storm of paranoia and hallucination, but my body remembers things my mind wants to forget. The way the air changed texture, the feeling of being hollowed out and filled with something else, the certainty that I was sharing space with a presence that knew me better than I knew myself. Sometimes I wonder if I actually left at all, or if I'm still sitting in that chair, book in my lap, while my shadow performs its dance on the wall. Maybe this whole life, this new city, this distance I think I've created, is just another shadow, another reflection that doesn't quite match reality. What scares me most isn't the memory of what happened, but the growing certainty that it isn't over. That whatever was in that house, whatever was watching and waiting and learning, followed me when I left. Not in any way I can prove or point to, but in the way that trauma follows, in the way that some experiences change the fundamental frequency at which you exist. I'm telling you this story now because I need someone else to know, need these words to exist outside my own mind. But even as I speak, I can feel that familiar pressure building in my chest, can smell the faint sweetness in the air that means I'm not alone. The shadow this lamp casts on the wall behind me is moving just slightly out of sync with my gestures, and I'm afraid to turn around to confirm what I already know. I thought distance would save me, but some things can't be left behind. Some things become part of you, woven into the fabric of who you are, and no amount of miles or time can undo that joining. I am still in that house, and that house is still in me, and I'm beginning to understand that this was always how it was meant to be. Story 6. There was a time when I dismissed it as mere coincidence, something that existed in the periphery of my daily routine. Every morning while sipping my coffee, I'd notice a pair of shoes left outside the neighboring door, the same pair, side by side, always facing the same direction. Yet one day the left shoe was inexplicably turned at an angle. I shrugged it off at first until it happened again, the same shoe, now slightly scuffed. Yesterday I noticed a new pair, but only one shoe was there. The other had vanished, leaving behind a hint of unease I can't quite shake. To whoever finds this letter, if anyone ever does, I need to tell you something I've never told another soul, something that's been eating at me from the inside out, growing like a shadow that stretches longer each day. I'm writing this because I can't carry it anymore. The weight of it is crushing my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to sleep, hard to pretend everything is normal when nothing has been normal for so long now. I've kept this secret buried so deep I sometimes wonder if I imagined it all. But then I see those shoes again in my mind and I know, God help me, I know it all started there. You have to understand I was never the type to believe in things that couldn't be explained. I paid my taxes, went to work, watched the evening news. I lived in the world of concrete and paychecks and grocery lists. But now I'm writing to you from somewhere else entirely, somewhere I never wanted to be. The shoes, they keep coming back to me, not just in memory, but in dreams that feel more real than waking. In those dreams, I'm standing in the hallway again, coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at that single shoe. In the dreams, though, I can hear something, a sound like fabric brushing against wood, like someone walking with only one foot covered. I started paying attention after that first morning, really paying attention. The kind of attention that makes your eyes burn and your neck ache because you're afraid to blink, afraid to miss something crucial. The hallway began to feel different, longer somehow. The fluorescent light above flickered in patterns I started to recognize, though I couldn't tell you what they meant. 3 days after the shoe disappeared, I heard footsteps above my apartment. Slow, deliberate, one heavy step, then a lighter one. Heavy light, like someone walking with only one shoe. I need you to understand I checked. I climbed those stairs on shaking legs and knocked on every door. The building manager told me the floor above mine had been empty for months. Water damage, he said, unsafe for occupancy. But I heard those footsteps every night after that, always the same rhythm, always starting at exactly the same time I finished my coffee. The sleep stopped coming naturally after the first week. I'd lie in bed, sheets twisted around my legs, listening to that uneven walking overhead. When I finally did drift off, I'd dream of hallways that stretched on forever, lined with doors that all had single shoes waiting outside them. In the dreams, I was always searching for something, the other shoe maybe, or the person who'd left it behind. But here's the thing that really scares me, the thing that makes my hands shake as I write this. I started leaving my own shoes outside my door. I don't remember deciding to do it. I just woke up one morning and there they were, placed carefully side by side, facing the same direction as the ones that had started it all. My feet were bare and cold against the bathroom tiles, and I couldn't remember taking the shoes off, couldn't remember opening my door, couldn't remember anything about the night before. The mirror in my bathroom began to feel wrong around this time, not broken or cracked, just wrong. When I looked into it, I looked like myself, but there was something in my eyes that hadn't been there before, a distance, like I was looking at myself from very far away, or like the person in the mirror was looking back at me from somewhere else entirely. I tried to tell my coworkers about the insomnia, made jokes about thin walls and noisy neighbors. They nodded and offered sympathy, but their eyes slid away from mine when they spoke, like they couldn't quite focus on me, like I was becoming harder to see. The footsteps changed after I started leaving my shoes out. Instead of the heavy light pattern, they became synchronized, 2 feet walking together, but somehow I knew one was still bare. I could hear the difference in the sound, the way skin meets floor differently than rubber or leather. I began to lose time during the day. I'd be at my desk typing a report, and suddenly the sun would be setting and my computer screen would be full of words I didn't remember writing. Not nonsense coherent sentences, proper grammar, but about things I'd never experienced. Walks through corridors I'd never seen. Conversations with people whose faces I couldn't recall. Always there was mention of shoes, of walking, of searching for something that stayed just out of reach. The other tenants in my building started looking through me when we passed in the hallway, not avoiding eye contact that would have been normal urban politeness. This was different. They looked through the space where I stood like I wasn't occupying it anymore. The mailman continued to deliver my mail, but he never acknowledged my thanks. The grocery store clerks rang up my purchases with vacant smiles that never quite landed on my face. I stopped sleeping in my bed after I woke up one morning to find muddy footprints leading from my front door to my bedroom and back again. Bare feet, size and shape matching my own, but I hadn't left my apartment in days. I'd been too afraid to open the door, too afraid to see what might be waiting outside. But somehow something had been walking in my space while I slept, something with my feet. The coffee began to taste different, bitter in a way that coated my throat and made me gag. But I kept drinking it every morning, kept standing at my window, kept watching that space where the shoes had been. Sometimes I thought I saw them again, flickering in and out of existence like a television with bad reception. Other times I saw different shoes, work boots, high heels, children's sneakers, always in pairs, always facing the same direction until one would turn or disappear entirely. I realized I was becoming the thing I'd been watching. The dreams grew more vivid, more detailed. I walked through endless apartment buildings, climbing stairs that led to more stairs, opening doors that revealed more hallways lined with more doors. In every dream I was barefoot and I could feel the cold of the floors seeping up through my skin, spreading through my bones. I was always looking for something, always following a sound just around the next corner. The sound of someone walking with only one shoe. When I woke from these dreams, my feet would be dirty. I tried to leave, packed a bag, called in sick to work, made it as far as the building's front entrance before I realized I couldn't remember how to open the door. Not that it was locked or stuck, I couldn't remember the physical process of turning a handle, of pushing or pulling, of moving from inside to outside. I stood there for hours, my hand hovering inches from the handle, until someone else came along and opened it from the other side. They walked right through me like I was made of air. That's when I knew I was disappearing. Not dying, disappearing, fading out of the world like an old photograph left in sunlight. The footsteps above my apartment had become my footsteps, walking the same path every night, searching for something I'd lost without knowing I'd ever had it. The shoes outside my door multiplied, different pairs appearing and vanishing, always leaving behind that sense of incompleteness, of something missing. I can feel it happening as I write this. My handwriting is getting lighter, harder to see on the page. The pen feels less solid in my fingers with each word. Soon, I think, I'll be nothing but the sound of footsteps in empty hallways, the whisper of fabric against wood, the ghost of unease that someone else will notice and dismiss as mere coincidence. Maybe you'll be the one who finds this letter. Maybe you'll read it and think I was crazy, that isolation and insomnia played tricks on my mind. Maybe you'll be right. But if you ever find yourself paying too much attention to small details, to patterns that shouldn't mean anything but somehow do, to the spaces between things rather than the things themselves, be careful. Be so very careful. Because I think the world is full of spaces between spaces, and some of us are meant to fall through them. Some of us are meant to become the mysteries that others notice and dismiss and forget. I can barely see my hand moving across the page now. The words are appearing, but faintly, like they're being written by someone who's almost gone. The footsteps overhead have stopped. I think they're waiting for me. I should go now. I should join the walking, the endless searching through corridors that exist in the margins of the real world. But I wanted to leave this behind first. Evidence that I was here, that I noticed, that I cared about the mystery, even as I became part of it. If you find this letter, know that somewhere in the spaces between your daily routines, I'm still walking. Still searching for the other shoe, for the missing piece, for the thing that will make the pattern complete. And maybe if you pay attention, if you really look at the small details that don't quite fit, you'll see me. A flicker in your peripheral vision, a shadow that doesn't match its object, a footstep that echoes just a moment too long. Don't look too hard though, don't pay too much attention. You might end up walking with me. Story 7. It was the scent of overripe oranges that greeted me, clinging to the air in the hallway. Sweet, almost intoxicating, yet distinctly out of place in a house that hadn't seen fresh fruit in weeks. I hesitated at the threshold, the unexpected aroma unraveling a string of memories I had long secured away. The walls seemed to lean in as if drawn by my confusion, and for a moment the hallway appeared narrower, tighter. I moved forward, drawn by a compulsion to find the source. The air grew dense with the scent, each step thickening the atmosphere. I remembered that smell from another house, another time, when the past felt like it could be rewritten. I shouldn't have followed it, but I did. That was 3 weeks ago. The scent is gone now, but something else has taken its place. A hollow feeling in my chest, like a cavity where a memory should be. I know something happened to me, something significant. The evidence is everywhere if I know how to look for it. The way I flinch when I hear certain electronic frequencies. The way I automatically check the corners of rooms before entering. The way I wake up with my hands pressed against my ears, as if I've been trying to block out a sound that exists only in sleep. I've been different since then. People notice it too, though they can't quite place what's changed. I catch them studying my face when they think I'm not looking, searching for something familiar that's no longer there. The problem is I can't remember what I've lost. Only that something has been taken from me, carved out with surgical precision, leaving behind only the faint outline of its absence. I decided to reconstruct what I could, to gather the fragments and see if they might form a picture, however incomplete. The first concrete clue came from my phone's voice memo app. There were recordings I didn't remember making, time-stamped from that period I can't quite recall. Most were corrupted, filled with static that seemed to breathe and pulse with its own rhythm. But one file, buried among the digital debris, contained something recognizable. My own voice, though it sounded distant, as if spoken through water. The frequency is getting stronger, I heard myself say. The recording quality was poor, distorted by interference that created patterns in the static. It's not just sound anymore, it's becoming something I can see. The air shimmers when it peaks, like heat waves, but cold, so cold it makes my teeth ache. I don't remember saying those words, I don't remember experiencing what they describe. Yet as I listened, something stirred in the depths of my mind, a sensation of standing in a room filled with that strange, breathing static. The memory felt second-hand, like watching someone else's home movie, but the physical reactions were immediate and real. My jaw began to throb, the air around me seemed to thicken. The first fragment came to me while I was replaying the recording for the 4th time. Without warning, I was somewhere else, not physically, but mentally transported to a space that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. I was standing in what might have been a living room, though the proportions seemed wrong. The ceiling stretched higher than it should have, disappearing into shadows that moved independently of any light source. There were voices in that space, but they didn't behave like voices should. They would start as whispers and gradually increase in volume, but instead of becoming clearer, they became more distorted, more fragmented. Multiple conversations overlapping, creating a linguistic static that hurt to process. I remember trying to focus on individual words, but they would slip away the moment I thought I'd grasped them, leaving behind only the impression of meaning without content. The lights in that remembered room moved in ways that defied logic. Not light fixtures, but the light itself, flowing across surfaces like liquid, pooling in corners and then suddenly dispersing in all directions at once. When I tried to follow its movement with my eyes, I felt a disorienting vertigo, as if the room was rotating around me while I remained stationary. That fragment lasted only seconds before dissolving, leaving me back in my present reality, but with the lingering sensation that I had been observed while remembering. Not by anyone in the room with me, because I was alone, but by something that existed in the space between memory and experience. I found myself compulsively checking my reflection after that, searching for changes I couldn't define. My face looked the same, but there was something in my eyes that seemed different, a quality of attention, as if part of me was always listening for something just beyond the range of normal hearing. I started leaving recording devices running throughout the house, hoping to capture whatever I might be unconsciously monitoring. Most of the recordings contained nothing unusual. Hours of ambient household sounds, the hum of appliances, the settling of walls, but occasionally there would be something else. A sound that resembled breathing, but with a mechanical quality, as if produced by machinery designed to mimic biological functions. The sound would appear without warning, continue for varying lengths of time, and then stop just as abruptly. The second fragment arrived while I was analyzing one of these recordings. I had isolated the breathing sound and was playing it through headphones when the memory struck with startling clarity. I was in a different space this time, somewhere that felt more confined. The walls were closer, and there was a quality to the air that suggested I was not alone, though I couldn't see anyone else. Behind me there was a presence. Not a person exactly, but something that occupied space in a way that created pressure against my back. I remember the overwhelming urge to turn around, coupled with an equally strong compulsion to remain facing forward. The conflict between these impulses created a paralysis that felt both terrifying and necessary. The presence made sounds, but not with any vocal apparatus I could recognize. The sounds seemed to originate from multiple points simultaneously, creating a three-dimensional audio experience that surrounded me completely. There were clicks and whispers, electronic tones that shifted frequency in patterns that almost resembled language, and underneath it all, that mechanical breathing I had captured in my recordings. During this fragment, all the lights went out. Not gradually, but instantly, as if someone had thrown a master switch. Yet somehow I could still see. The darkness itself seemed to glow with a faint luminescence that made everything visible while simultaneously making it impossible to focus on any specific detail. Objects appeared to exist in a state of constant, subtle movement, never quite settling into fixed positions. The fragment ended when I tried to speak, to ask what was happening. The moment I opened my mouth, everything snapped back to the present, leaving me sitting at my desk with the recording still playing through my headphones. But the mechanical breathing sound was no longer coming from the recording. It was coming from somewhere behind me in the room. I turned around slowly, knowing I would find nothing, and I was right. The room was empty. But the breathing continued for several more seconds before fading away, and during those seconds I noticed that my own reflection in the window was slightly out of sync with my movements. When I raised my hand, the reflection followed a fraction of a second later, as if the image had to travel a greater distance to reach the glass. These distortions in my present reality became more frequent as I continued my investigation. Sounds that only I could hear, shadows that moved independently of their sources, and a persistent feeling that the space around me was being observed and catalogued by something with an intelligence I couldn't comprehend. I started finding objects in my house that I didn't remember acquiring. Small things, easily overlooked unless you were specifically looking for anomalies. A smooth, black stone that was always slightly warm to the touch. A piece of metal that looked like it had been torn from something larger, with edges that seemed impossibly sharp yet never cut my fingers when I handled it. These objects would appear in different locations each day, as if they were moving themselves or being moved by someone else. The stone in particular seemed to have unusual properties. When I held it, I could feel a faint vibration, irregular and pulsing like a heartbeat that occasionally skipped. Sometimes the vibration would intensify, and during those moments I would catch glimpses of things that shouldn't exist in my peripheral vision. Shapes that dissolved when I tried to look at them directly, movements that suggested the presence of something large navigating through spaces too small to contain it. The final fragment came when I was holding the stone and examining the piece of metal simultaneously. The combination seemed to act as a catalyst, triggering a memory so vivid and complete that it felt more real than my present surroundings. I was back in that first room with the impossible ceiling, but now I could see everything with perfect clarity. The light wasn't moving randomly as I had initially thought. It was tracing patterns, complex geometric designs that covered every surface of the room. The patterns were beautiful and terrible, containing a logic that my mind could almost grasp but never quite hold onto. The voices weren't speaking in any human language, but somehow I understood their meaning. They were discussing me, analyzing my responses to various stimuli, recording data about my reactions. I was not a participant in whatever was happening. I was a subject being studied, tested, cataloged for purposes I couldn't begin to imagine. But the most disturbing part of this final fragment wasn't what I remembered seeing or hearing. It was what I remembered understanding. In that space, with those impossible lights and those analyzing voices, I had been given knowledge. Information about the nature of reality that was too large and too contradictory for a human mind to contain. The knowledge had been inserted into my consciousness deliberately, and then, just as deliberately, it had been removed. I could feel the shape of that missing knowledge, like a tooth that had been extracted, leaving behind a socket that my tongue couldn't stop probing. The removal hadn't been complete, though. Fragments remained, embedded too deeply to extract without causing permanent damage. Those fragments were what allowed me to perceive the distortions in my present reality, to hear the sounds that shouldn't exist, to see the movements in my peripheral vision. I was changed because I had been changed, deliberately and systematically altered by intelligences that viewed me as raw material for some incomprehensible experiment. The memory of that understanding filled me with a terror so profound that I could feel my mind already beginning to push it away, to bury it again in the depths where it couldn't poison my daily existence. But as the fragment faded and I returned to my present reality, I realized something that made my blood feel like ice water in my veins. The experiment wasn't over. It had never ended. The removal of my memories, the careful editing of my experiences, the gradual return of fragments through my investigation, all of it was part of a larger design. I was still being observed, still being tested. My attempts to reconstruct what had happened to me weren't acts of rebellion or recovery. They were part of the study itself, carefully orchestrated to produce specific responses that could be measured and recorded. The scent of overripe oranges had been a trigger, designed to initiate this phase of the experiment. My investigation, my growing unease, my desperate attempts to understand what had been done to me, all of it was unfolding exactly as intended by minds that could predict and manipulate human behavior with scientific precision. I set down the stone and the piece of metal, but I could still feel their vibrations in my fingertips. The mechanical breathing sound had returned, emanating from every direction at once, and this time I knew it would not fade away. The lights in my house began to move, flowing across the walls in those same geometric patterns I had seen in my recovered memory. I closed my eyes, but the patterns continued behind my eyelids, brighter and more complex than before. The voices started as whispers and began to grow louder, and I knew that when they reached full volume, when the patterns completed their design, the next phase of the experiment would begin. I opened my eyes and looked at my reflection in the window. It was still out of sync, but now I could see that it wasn't my reflection at all. It was someone else, someone who looked exactly like me, but whose eyes held knowledge I had been allowed to forget. The other me in the window smiled, and I felt my own lips moving in response, though I had not decided to smile. The question that haunts me now, as the walls begin to lean inward and the air thickens with that familiar scent of overripe oranges, is not what was done to me, or why, or by whom. The question is whether the person asking these questions is really me at all, or just another carefully constructed fragment, designed to believe in its own existence while serving purposes it will never be allowed to understand. The breathing grows louder, and I can feel that presence behind me again, patient and observing, waiting for me to turn around. This time I think I will. Story 8. I mentioned I'd only stayed on the ground floor, that the rain had kept me near the entrance, away from anything more. They seemed satisfied, jotting notes in rhythm with the drizzle outside, yet the damp scent of old wood lingered on my fingertips, stubborn and telling. The stairs had creaked a note that still echoed in my mind, carrying the weight of untold steps. A slight draft brushed my cheek with the chill of an unwelcome memory. The hallway light flickered, casting shadows that knew my path. I didn't mention the door half ajar, or the coat beside it, but the mud was drying on my shoes. I keep trying to remember what really happened. The pieces float in my head like debris after a storm, never quite settling into place. Sometimes I catch one, hold it for a moment, but then it slips away again. My fingers still smell like that wood, even after washing them, even after scrubbing until the skin turned raw. There was a sound, a humming. No, that's not right. It was more like breathing, but mechanical, like something large inhaling through metal lungs. I remember pressing my ear against a wall, feeling the vibration travel through my skull. The plaster was cold, damp. When I pulled away, there was a perfect outline of condensation where my face had been. The rain wasn't just outside, I'm certain of that now. Water was dripping somewhere inside, a steady rhythm that didn't match the storm. Drip, pause, it came from above, but when I looked up, the ceiling seemed solid, unmarked, yet my hair was wet when I touched it. Salt water, not rain. I remember shoes, not mine. They were lined up by the entrance like soldiers at attention. 12 pairs, maybe 13, all facing the same direction toward the stairs. The leather was polished but somehow wrong, too shiny, like they'd been coated in something that wasn't polish. When I counted them again, there were only 11. The coat was blue, navy blue with brass buttons that caught the light even in the dim hallway. It hung on a hook that shouldn't have been there. The wall was smooth when I ran my hand across it earlier, I'm sure of it. But the hook was old, rusted at the base like it had been there for decades. The coat's pockets bulged with something heavy. I didn't look inside. I should have looked inside. My reflection in the hallway mirror wasn't quite right. The angle was off, or maybe I was standing in the wrong place. The person looking back at me seemed taller. Their eyes were too bright, too focused. When I raised my hand to wave, they did it a second too late. When I stepped away, they lingered for a moment before following. There's a taste in my mouth that won't go away, copper and something else, something organic and sweet that makes my stomach turn. I've brushed my teeth dozens of times since then, used mouthwash until my gums burned, but it clings to the back of my throat like smoke. Sometimes I catch myself swallowing repeatedly, trying to wash it down, but it always returns. The floorboards upstairs were singing. That's the only way I can describe it. Each step produced a different note, a low moan that seemed to come from deep within the wood. I know I said I didn't go upstairs, but my legs remember the climb. My muscles hold the memory of lifting, of careful placement, of trying not to make noise while the house announced every movement. Light was bleeding under the door at the end of the hall. Not electric light, something warmer, more alive. It pulsed like a heartbeat, bright then dim, bright then dim. The air around the door frame shimmered with heat, and I could smell something burning. Not wood or paper, something else, something that shouldn't burn. I touched the door handle. The metal was so hot it should have burned my skin, but it didn't. Instead, it felt like touching ice. The contradiction made my teeth ache. When I turned the handle, it moved without resistance, as if it had been waiting for me. The door swung open on its own, revealing darkness that the light couldn't penetrate. There was someone in the room. I know there was. I could hear them breathing, could feel their presence like a weight pressing against my chest. But when I looked, there was only furniture covered in white sheets. The shapes underneath weren't quite right, too angular for chairs, too tall for tables. One of the sheets was moving slightly, as if something beneath it was shifting position. The humming was louder here. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, a deep thrumming that I felt in my bones. My vision started to blur at the edges, and the room began to tilt. I reached out to steady myself and touch something warm and yielding, skin. But when I looked down, my hand was resting on the back of a covered chair. I remember falling, or maybe I was pulled down. The floor rushed up to meet me, but I never felt the impact. Instead, I found myself lying on something soft. A bed, maybe, though I couldn't see it. Hands were touching me, examining me, but when I tried to focus on them, they dissolved like smoke. The touching continued, gentle but insistent, professional but somehow wrong. There were voices, whispered conversations just beyond my understanding. They spoke in a language that sounded almost familiar, like words I'd heard in dreams. Sometimes they seemed to be discussing me, and I caught fragments that made my skin crawl. Other times they argued among themselves, their voices rising to an urgent hiss before dropping back to whispers. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something organic and rotten. Medical equipment gleamed in the pulsing light, but the instruments were wrong. Too old-fashioned, too crude. Leather straps hung from the sides of what might have been an examination table. They were stained dark with something that wasn't rust. I tried to move, to sit up, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like being trapped in a dream where your limbs are made of lead. I could feel everything, could think clearly, but I was completely paralyzed. The voices grew excited when they realized I was conscious. They moved closer, and I could smell their breath. Sweet and cloying like fruit left too long in the sun. Something was inserted into my arm, a needle, thin and cold. The liquid that flowed into my veins was warm and thick. My vision began to fragment, breaking into pieces like a shattered mirror. Each shard showed me a different angle of the room, a different face leaning over me. But when I tried to focus on any one face, it shifted and changed, features flowing like wax. The procedure lasted forever and no time at all. I felt myself being opened, examined, catalogued, but there were no incisions, no pain, Instead, it was as if they were reaching inside me without breaking the skin, their fingers probing places that shouldn't exist. They took something from me. I don't know what, but I can feel the absence, a hollow space where something important used to be. When it was over, I found myself back in the hallway. The door was closed, the light no longer bleeding underneath. The coat was gone. The shoes had been rearranged, now facing away from the stairs toward the exit. My reflection in the mirror looked normal again, but somehow diminished, smaller, less substantial. I walked down the stairs carefully, each step triggering that same musical note, but now the song was different, sadder somehow. The melody spoke of loss, of something precious taken and never to be returned. My hand trailed along the banister, and I noticed that my fingerprints left marks in what looked like fresh dust. The rain had stopped by the time I reached the ground floor. Sunlight streamed through the windows, revealing details I hadn't noticed before. Scratches in the wallpaper that looked like tally marks. Stains on the carpet that formed patterns too deliberate to be accidental. A photograph on a side table showing people I almost recognized, their faces familiar but somehow wrong. I left through the front door, but I don't remember opening it. One moment I was inside, the next I was standing on the porch, blinking in the sudden brightness. The house behind me looked different in the daylight, smaller, more ordinary, but when I turned back for one last look, all the windows on the upper floor were filled with faces, watching, waiting. Now I sit here trying to piece it all together. The officials believed my story about staying on the ground floor. They had no reason to doubt me, but the evidence is everywhere if you know where to look. The smell on my fingers, the taste in my mouth, the hollow feeling where something used to be. Sometimes in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I can hear that humming again. It's getting stronger, more insistent. And I know with a certainty that terrifies me that whatever happened in that room isn't finished. They took something from me, but they also left something behind, a connection, a calling. The memories are becoming clearer each day, more detailed, more complete, and with that clarity comes the understanding that I wasn't just a visitor in that house. I was an appointment, expected, prepared for. I can feel them calling me back. The humming in my head grows louder when I sleep, and I wake with the taste of copper stronger than ever. My reflection in mirrors has started to lag again, just slightly, just enough to notice. They're not done with me yet, and deep down in the hollow space where something important used to be, I know I'm not done with them either. The mud on my shoes has finally dried. But underneath, pressed into the soul like a brand, is the outline of that house's front door key. I think I'm ready to go back, story 9. The notification light didn't blink. My fingers brushed the screen, seeking the familiar vibration, but it remained inert, unresponsive. The chair creaked under my weight without the usual reassuring groan, as though it too held its breath. The room drew in closer, the quiet pressing at the edges, and when I expected the distant hum of distant traffic, there was only a void. I focused on the wallpaper's pattern, each line and swirl pretending, as if any moment they might shift and betray their true design. The absence filled the space, tangible, as if daring me to acknowledge what had ceased to exist. I've been sitting here for what feels like hours, trying to remember what happened to me. There's a gap in my memory, a clean slice through my consciousness that feels too precise to be natural. I know something occurred, something that changed me in ways I can't articulate. My hands shake when I try to recall the details, and there's this persistent taste in my mouth, metallic and foreign, like I've been breathing through copper wire. The apartment feels different now. Objects seem slightly displaced, as though someone has been moving through my space, adjusting things by millimeters. The coffee mug I left on the counter now sits 3 inches to the left. The books on my shelf lean at angles that don't match my memory. Even my reflection in the bathroom mirror appears somehow unfamiliar, though I can't pinpoint what has changed. I found something today that might help me understand. While cleaning out a drawer I rarely open, my fingers brushed against a small recording device I don't remember owning. It's sleek black with a surface that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. The weight feels wrong in my palm, too heavy for its size, and when I hold it there's a subtle vibration, irregular and unsettling, like a heartbeat with an extra chamber. The device contains a single audio file. I've listened to it dozens of times now, but each playback reveals new layers of sound buried beneath what initially seems like static. There's my voice, distant and distorted, speaking words I can't quite make out. Behind it, something else breathes into the microphone, creating a rhythm that doesn't match human respiration. The frequency shifts unpredictably, rising to a pitch that makes my teeth ache, then dropping to a subsonic rumble I feel in my chest cavity. Listening to the recording triggers flashes of memory, fragments that surface like debris from a shipwreck. I see lights, but not normal illumination. These are white bursts that seem to originate from everywhere and nowhere, impossible to focus on directly. They strobe in patterns that hurt to remember, creating afterimages that persist even when I close my eyes. The lights move with purpose, following trajectories that defy the geometry of any space I've ever inhabited. In these fragments, I'm standing in what might be my living room, but the dimensions are wrong. The ceiling stretches impossibly high, and the walls curve inward like the interior of a sphere. My furniture floats at various heights, suspended by forces I cannot see. The carpet beneath my feet ripples like water, and when I try to walk, my steps produce no sound, as though the air itself has been drained of its ability to carry vibrations. There are voices in this memory, but they don't emerge from mouths or speakers. The words seem to form directly inside my skull, bypassing my ears entirely. The language is almost familiar, like a dialect of something I once knew but have since forgot. The voices overlap, creating harmonies that shouldn't be possible with human vocal cords. They discuss me as though I'm not present, referring to me in terms that make my skin crawl with recognition I can't explain. Another fragment surfaces when I touch the recording device to my forehead. The power in my building has gone out, but this darkness is different from any blackout I've experienced. It's not merely the absence of light, but the presence of something that actively consumes illumination. I can feel it moving behind me, matching my movements with perfect synchronization. When I turn to look, it turns as well, always staying just outside my peripheral vision. The air carries a scent during these memories, something I can only describe as new plastic mixed with cold blood. It's not unpleasant exactly, but deeply wrong, like breathing in the essence of something that should not exist in the same space as living tissue. The smell clings to my nasal passages, persisting even after the memory fades, leaving me with the unsettling certainty that whatever produced that odor has been very close to me. As I continue my investigation, reality itself begins to behave strangely. My reflection in windows lags behind my movements by fractions of a second. The shadows in my apartment point in directions that don't correspond to any light source. When I record myself speaking, the playback reveals additional voices layered beneath my own, whispering in languages that predate human speech. The recording device grows warmer in my hands as I delve deeper into my fragmented memories. Its vibrations intensify, creating a rhythm that seems to synchronize with my heartbeat, then gradually pull it into a new pattern. My pulse adjusts to match the device's frequency, and with each synchronized beat, another memory fragment crystallizes. I remember standing before something vast and geometrically impossible, a structure that my mind refuses to fully process. Its surface shifts between states of matter, sometimes solid, sometimes liquid, occasionally existing as pure concept rather than physical form. The thing communicates without language, downloading information directly into my consciousness. The data transfer feels like drowning in reverse, as though knowledge is being extracted rather than received. In the clearest fragment, I see myself from an external perspective, as though watching through someone else's eyes. I'm suspended in midair, arms spread wide, head tilted back in an expression of either ecstasy or terror. My mouth moves, but the words that emerge belong to someone else, spoken in a voice that carries harmonics no human throat could produce. Below me, the floor has become transparent, revealing an infinite void populated by geometric shapes that pulse with their own internal light. The memory becomes more vivid as I watch myself undergo some kind of procedure. Invisible hands manipulate my limbs, positioning me with clinical precision. Something is being inserted into my consciousness, not through any physical opening, but by reaching directly through the fabric of my awareness. The sensation is indescribable, like having thoughts implanted that aren't my own, memories of experiences I never lived but somehow recognize. Present reality continues to deteriorate as I reconstruct these fragments. The walls of my apartment occasionally become translucent, revealing spaces that shouldn't exist beyond them. I catch glimpses of vast chambers filled with machinery that operates on principles I don't understand, tended by figures that move with fluid grace but cast no shadows. The sounds around me shift frequency without warning. The refrigerator's hum drops to a bass note that vibrates through the floor. The air conditioning creates harmonies with itself, producing chords that shouldn't be possible from a single source. Even my own breathing generates overtones, as though my lungs have been retuned to resonate with frequencies beyond human perception. My final recovered memory is the most disturbing. I see the moment when my memories were being selectively removed, extracted like surgical specimens, and stored in crystalline containers that refract light in impossible directions. The process is performed by entities that exist primarily as mathematical concepts given temporary physical form. They work with the precision of surgeons and the detachment of researchers, discussing my case in terms that reduce my entire existence to a series of variables in an equation I'm not equipped to understand. As they work, I remain conscious, watching my own experiences being cataloged and filed away. The most significant memories, the ones that would allow me to understand what has been done to me, are sealed in containers that exist outside normal space-time. I watch helplessly as pieces of myself are archived in a library that spans dimensions I lack the sensory apparatus to perceive. The memory ends with one of the entities turning to address me directly. Its form shifts constantly, never maintaining a single configuration long enough for my mind to process, but its attention is unmistakably focused on my consciousness. It speaks without words, implanting a message directly into my awareness. The reconstruction is proceeding as designed. Memory fragments will surface according to schedule. Integration will resume upon completion of the observation period. I drop the recording device, but it doesn't fall. Instead, it hovers at chest height, rotating slowly while emitting a low harmonic that seems to emanate from inside my own bones. The apartment around me flickers between its current configuration and the impossible geometries from my recovered memories. The walls breathe with a rhythm that matches my pulse, and the floor beneath my feet has developed a subtle transparency that reveals depths that shouldn't exist. The investigation has revealed more than I wanted to know, yet left me with questions that multiply like fractal patterns. I understand now that my memories weren't lost accidentally. They were carefully removed and stored, leaving behind just enough fragments to ensure I would eventually attempt this reconstruction. The process itself was anticipated, planned for, incorporated into some larger design that uses my curiosity as a component in its operation. The recording device continues its slow rotation, and I realize that my investigation has been observed from the beginning. Every moment of confusion, every fragment recovered, every growing certainty that something fundamental has been altered about my existence has been monitored and recorded by the same entities that initially removed my memories. The apartment's geometry shifts more frequently now, walls sliding into new configurations that reveal rooms I've never seen but somehow recognize. The furniture rearranges itself according to patterns that serve purposes I'm not meant to understand. Even my own body feels different, as though the process of remembering has activated changes that were installed during my initial encounter. I can feel them watching me now, not from outside but from within my own consciousness, using the very memories I've recovered as windows through which to observe my reactions. The investigation was never about uncovering the truth. It was about preparing me for the next phase of whatever process I've become part of. The recording device finally settles into my palm, its surface now warm enough to feel almost alive. The vibrations synchronize perfectly with my heartbeat, and I understand that the integration period is ending. Soon, the observation phase will conclude, and I'll discover what I've been prepared for. But that knowledge remains just beyond my reach, hidden behind the same barriers that initially concealed my memories. I'm left with the growing certainty that remembering was never the goal. The fragments were meant to be found. The investigation was designed to unfold exactly as it has, and I am no longer the same person who began this search for answers. The question that haunts me now isn't what happened to me, but what I'm becoming, and whether the consciousness asking that question is still entirely my own. Story 10. The initial assessment showed all windows latched securely. Furniture placement appeared untouched, with chairs aligned to the dining table and the sofa free of debris. A calendar on the wall noted dates without any markings beyond printed numbers. In the kitchen, utensils were stowed correctly, though a single plate remained on the countertop, devoid of residue. The refrigerator hummed at the expected decibel level, yet its contents failed to match inventory records. The hallway carpet was vacuumed, leaving uniform lines, yet the air felt colder than usual. The ceiling fan was off, but the blades rotated slowly. I know they'll find nothing wrong, nothing that matters anyway. The investigators will file their report with clinical precision, noting anomalies that don't quite add up to evidence. They'll measure the temperature differential, document the inventory discrepancy, photograph the clean plate, but they won't understand what it means to live inside a house that's forgotten how to be a house. They can't see what I see now, standing here in this doorway, watching them catalog the aftermath of my careful preparations. The blades turn without wind, without electricity, without reason. Just like everything else here has learned to move according to rules I never taught it. My hands are steady now. That surprises me most of all. After everything that happened, after all the nights when I couldn't stop them from shaking, they've finally found their stillness. It's not peace exactly, more like the quiet that comes after a storm has torn through and left nothing standing tall enough to catch the wind. I can feel the house breathing around me, its walls expanding and contracting with a rhythm that doesn't match my own pulse. The investigators don't notice this, of course. They're focused on their measurements, their photographs, their tidy explanations for things that refuse to be explained. The cleaning took longer than I expected. Each surface had to be addressed twice, sometimes 3 times, because the house kept undoing my work. I'd wipe down the kitchen counter and return an hour later to find new smudges, new stains that hadn't been there before. The vacuum lines in the carpet would shift when I wasn't looking, creating patterns that hurt to examine too closely. But I kept at it methodically because I understood by then that preparation was everything. The house wanted to be ready for this moment, wanted to present its best face to the strangers who would come asking questions I couldn't answer. The plate was the hardest part. It sat on the counter for days, maybe weeks, accumulating a film of dust that would disappear each morning, only to return by evening. I tried moving it to the cabinet, but it would migrate back to its spot beside the sink, patient as a cat waiting for food. Eventually, I stopped fighting it. The house knew what it needed, and I was just the caretaker, making sure everything looked normal for the people who would never understand what normal had become. Before the cleaning began, I spent hours walking through each room, memorizing the way things were. The way they had become, because they weren't the way I'd left them anymore. Furniture had shifted incrementally over time, creating new pathways through familiar spaces. The sofa faced a different direction, though I couldn't remember moving it. Books on the shelves were arranged by height rather than subject, though I'd never been that kind of organized person. The house was teaching itself new habits, and I was learning to live within them. The inventory problem started small. A missing can of soup, an extra loaf of bread I didn't remember buying. I began keeping lists, checking and rechecking the contents of cupboards and the refrigerator, but the numbers never stayed consistent. Items would multiply overnight or vanish entirely, following some logic I couldn't grasp. The refrigerator hummed louder during these changes, working harder to maintain its temperature, while its contents rearranged themselves according to principles that had nothing to do with expiration dates or meal planning. I stopped eating regularly around this time, not from lack of appetite, but because I couldn't trust what I found in the kitchen. The bread felt different in my hands, denser somehow, though it looked identical to what I'd purchased. Milk tasted faintly metallic, even when it was fresh from the store. The house was processing everything that entered it, changing it in ways too subtle for the naked eye but too obvious for my tongue to ignore. I survived on crackers and water, things that seemed too simple for the house to bother altering. The ceiling fan became my barometer for the house's mood. When things were quiet, when the walls held their shape and the floors stayed level, the blades would hang motionless. But during the active periods, when I could feel the house stretching and settling into new configurations, they would begin their slow rotation. Never fast enough to create a breeze, never accompanied by the familiar hum of the motor. Just that steady, hypnotic turning that seemed to count time in units I didn't recognize. Sleep became impossible in the bedroom, not because of noise, but because of the absence of it. The room had developed a quality of silence so complete it felt aggressive, pressing against my eardrums until I could hear my own blood moving through my veins. I tried earplugs, white noise machines, even soft music, but nothing could penetrate that deliberate quiet. Eventually, I moved to the living room couch, where the sounds from other parts of the house could reach me. The settling creaks, the whisper of air through vents, the occasional pop of expanding wood. Normal house sounds that had become precious because they proved I wasn't completely alone. The dreams that did come were always the same. I would find myself standing in rooms that were almost familiar, furnished with pieces that resembled my belongings but weren't quite right. The kitchen table would be too tall, forcing me to reach up to place dishes on its surface. The bathroom mirror would reflect a face that looked like mine but older, more tired, with eyes that had seen things I couldn't remember seeing. I would wake on the couch with the taste of dust in my mouth and the certainty that I had been walking through my own house while my body slept. During the day, I began mapping the changes. The house was growing, adding inches to hallways and feet to rooms in ways that shouldn't have been architecturally possible. I measured doorways with a tape measure, marking the results on scraps of paper that would disappear by morning. But I could feel the expansion in my body, in the way familiar distances now required extra steps, in the way reaching for light switches meant extending my arm further than muscle memory suggested. The windows were the first thing I noticed changing, not their size or placement, but their view. The yard outside looked the same, but the perspective was wrong, as if I were looking down from a higher floor or at a different angle. Trees that should have been visible were blocked by the window frame. Bushes appeared in spots where I remembered open grass. I tried going outside to confirm what I was seeing, but the door handle wouldn't turn, not locked exactly. Just resistant, as if the house preferred I stay inside where it could keep track of me. I called for help exactly once. The phone worked fine, connected me to the right number, let me explain my situation to a patient voice on the other end. But as I spoke, I could hear my own words changing, becoming reasonable and mundane. Instead of describing expanding rooms and rotating fan blades, I heard myself complaining about minor maintenance issues and requesting a routine inspection. The house was editing me in real time, ensuring that only acceptable problems would reach the outside world. The voice on the phone scheduled an appointment, promised someone would come to assess the situation. After I hung up, I understood that I had just arranged for this moment, this scene I'm witnessing now. The investigators with their clipboards and cameras, documenting a house that has learned to hide its true nature behind a facade of minor irregularities. They'll file their report and leave, and I'll remain here with a house that has finally achieved whatever it was working toward. But before all of this, before the changes and the dreams and the careful preparations, there was something else. A moment so small I almost missed it, so ordinary it seemed insignificant. I can see it now, rewinding through all the strangeness to find the seed from which everything grew. I had been hanging a picture, a simple landscape print I'd bought at a discount store, nothing special, just something to fill the empty space above the mantelpiece. The nail went in easily, the frame hung level on the first try. But when I stepped back to admire the placement, I noticed something in the reflection on the glass. Not my own reflection, which would have been normal, but a reflection of the room that didn't match what I could see when I turned around. In the glass, the furniture was arranged differently. The sofa faced the opposite direction, the coffee table was positioned at an angle, the bookshelf stood against a different wall. I turned to check, but everything was exactly where I'd placed it. When I looked back at the picture, the reflection showed my familiar room, my actual room, arranged exactly as it should be. I took the picture down immediately, wrapped it in newspaper, and put it in a closet. But the house had already seen something in that moment of doubled reality. It had glimpsed a possibility, a version of itself that existed in reflections and dreams and the spaces between what is and what could be. And slowly, carefully, with the patience of something that had all the time in the world, it began making that possibility real. The picture is still in the closet. I can feel it there, wrapped in yesterday's news, waiting. The investigators won't think to look for it, won't understand its significance even if they find it. But I know it's the key to everything that followed, the moment when my house learned that it didn't have to be limited by the rules I thought governed our shared existence. That was the beginning, a picture hung on a wall, a reflection that showed too much, a house that discovered it could be more than the sum of its rooms and walls and foundation. Everything else, all the changes and expansions and careful preparations, grew from that single moment when reality hiccuped and my house caught a glimpse of what lay beyond the boundaries I'd never thought to question. Now the investigators are packing their equipment, satisfied with their measurements and photographs. They've found nothing they can't explain, nothing that violates their understanding of how houses should behave. The ceiling fan has stopped turning, the refrigerator hums at acceptable levels, the carpet shows only the vacuum lines I created this morning. But I know better. I know that as soon as they leave, as soon as their car disappears around the corner, the house will begin to breathe again. The walls will resume their subtle expansion, the furniture will drift toward new configurations, and the ceiling fan will start its patient rotation. Because the house has learned that it doesn't need my permission to be what it wants to be. And I've learned that some reflections show more truth than reality ever could.